All right, happy Thursday, everyone. And what a happy Thursday it is, because today is Recess at Work Day. Oh, maybe I should have saved that one for after the webinar. Whoops. Well, please don't go anywhere yet, because we've got another informative webinar on tap for you today. Mass timber construction is gaining momentum in the industry, but there are still challenges when it comes to building and specifying with mass timber. We have two guests from Hilti North America to help lead a discussion around the rise of mass timber, how fire stopping plays a role, and what it means for the future of building construction. Our first guest is Neal Clemens. He's a product manager in fire protection, working for Hilti North America in Plano, Texas. His role includes development of innovative fire protection products, as well as driving strategic partnerships and opportunities in new segments of business throughout North America. Clemens holds an undergraduate degree in biology and an MBA from the University of Central Florida. Neal is joined by Matthew Winston, who is actively engaged in the field of fire protection engineering. He currently holds the Certified Fire Protection Specialist designation and has passed the PE exam in fire protection engineering. He has completed an MS in fire protection engineering at California Polytechnic State University at San Luis Obispo, and he earned a BS in engineering sciences from California State University, Bakersfield. Matthew currently works as the testing and approvals engineer for FIRESTOPs at Hilti North America. Speaking of them, today's webinar is brought to you by Hilti North America. Hilti North America has over 3,800 highly trained team members in sales, engineering, marketing, and other support roles who all work to help construction professionals solve their biggest challenges. At Hilti North America, they go beyond just sitting in their offices. Their sales teams and field engineers meet their customers where they are, finding solutions to make builds safer, easier, and faster. During the course of today's presentation, you can submit questions for our guests. Simply use the questions box inside the GoToWebinar control panel, probably located on the right side of your screen. I'll review those questions and pose them to Neal and Matthew during the Q&A time set aside after their presentations, though we will take some questions during the transition from Neal to Matthew and then back from Matthew to Neal again. But for now, Neal, we'll kick things off with you.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Mike. And I look forward to going through with you guys today the story that we as a supporting manufacturer have gone through really as we've kind of entered this new era of construction, which is building high-rise and mass timber. So in terms of what we'll discuss today, we'll go through kind of the story so far at Hilti in terms of how we got introduced to the mass timber topic. And really, there's definitely a critical link that really you can kind of probably figure out from the agenda here that we'll go through as well, which is really centered around fire protection and fire stopping. And Matt Winston will talk a little bit more, Matthew, excuse me, will talk a little bit more about the testing efforts that we've undergone and really kind of walking you through the process because it's a really unique part of construction as we see it today in terms of how do we get a story put in place so that customers that want to build high can do so. So we'll talk a little about the certifications and listings, briefly touch on some of really important code changes coming in 2021, more like a high level, just basic understanding. And then as we see it as a manufacturer supporting this industry, really some of the innovation, and some of the topics such as prefabrication that are going to be instrumental in why customers are building with mass timber, followed by, like I said, mentioned the innovation and collaboration in terms of other types of products that are necessary to support this this initiative as well. And then we'll end up with any questions if there's any of those. So really, our involvement with mass timber started in 2017. We had some interest from different various manufacturers, including Nordic, that were interested in seeing what we could do to test some of their samples to see what would happen in the event of a fire. So the thought of building high, I think, was already starting early on in this topic, and we kind of took with it the opportunity to work with some manufacturers simply because in many cases, when they had tried to do some independent testing of their wood species and samples, they ran into some roadblocks when it came to specific requirements of testing or the fire protection or the life safety system of that particular project must adhere to, which is critical for any type of structure specifically, but also even more importantly and more relevant even in mass timber. So really that kind of kicked the story off. And then as we kind of dug a little deeper in terms of potential partnerships, we actually had the opportunity to link up together with KATERRA, and that is really kind of burgeoned into looking into several of the projects that they have across the country and also up in Canada, and really trying to evaluate a path forward as it relates mainly at the moment to fire protection, but as well as industry partnership. Because the reason we're listing this webinar as a supporting manufacturer, because when you look at mass timber, obviously you're thinking of a manufacturer of the wood products for the construction of these high-rise buildings, and we're not that. We're definitely a supporting manufacturer, which is we offer products that do support or provide a different function altogether. And you can see on the page here, these are some of the other examples that kind of in conjunction with when we first heard from KATERRA, we also were getting interest from other manufacturers to do some work and get some testing done for Oregon State University. And that really kind of catapulted our testing efforts. Matthew is the leader of that for us at Hilti currently, and he's really been instrumental in, and he'll elaborate a little bit more on this, but testing different products, not only of the industry, like such as the manufacturers of these other products, but also with various fire protection solutions that we offer as a manufacturer. And you can see some of the other projects that we've had some involvement with in terms of fire protection and other topics related to Hilti. And that brings us to other partnerships. So one of the things that I've found interesting is we're keenly interested in looking at opportunities as a manufacturer to grow industries and emerging industries. We have a very stronghold position, and we feel like in our industry with concrete construction as well as the steel type structures, wood presents obviously some incredible advantages in the world of what we see in terms of the environmental aspects, sustainability, but also some challenges. And what we've also encountered is other manufacturers that have very similar needs from a manufacturer like us. So it's specific to testing. You can see up there in the corner kind of a sample of some of the products. It's hard to see in the top there, but there are some products that we can talk about that actually are really ideal and designed and actually have performed very well in testing to support a fire protection program in mass timber. And then some of these other photos are just realistic examples of what the design community is looking for when it comes to not only the appearance and the aesthetics, but the ability to have as much of that wood exposed as possible, and also to ensure and reassure the customers and the people in the market that are looking for the developers, if you will, that picture in the bottom left corner shows us a truck holding, you know, the plank, basically a 7-ply mass timber plank supporting the weight of a pickup truck. So it really kind of, it creates a lot of excitement and buzz, I think, in the industry in terms of what can be. And we've really developed and tried to hone in on some of those partnerships, which are inclusive of Binderholz is another example, a European manufacturer. Nordic Structurecraft recently has also been working with us to provide some samples to test. And we'll get in a little bit more details about what some of that testing actually looks like and what's involved as it relates to this topic of fire protection. So initially, mass timber construction obviously created some challenges, and really, I've talked a little bit about it already, obviously with the fire protection, but when you break it down a little bit further and you look at the specification side of the business as well as the actual implementation or construction side, there was some major issues that I think a lot of earlier on, some of these manufacturers of mass timber products realized they needed to get an answer if they wanted to build up at all. And that is, in many cases, there wasn't anything clearly published by some of the major third-party testing agencies about listings. And in the world of fire protection, if you're a project manager and you're trying to pass inspection and you're trying to move from one phase of your project to the next, a critical component that you must have, according to the local authorities having jurisdiction or the inspectors, is listings. You have to have paperwork to support that whatever you're building obviously is in compliance with some type of building standard or code. And that's where there's been a little bit of a disconnect in the industry up to this point. So really, that was one of the initial findings that we felt like we could really, as a supporting manufacturer, really provide support and be able to drive, because of our expertise in the world of fire protection, and we are global leaders in that topic, of really putting a plan together. So, and the other part that came through with some of the discussions that we've had with specifically with the design community was really what is the plan here? How are we going to build up the 18 stories as an example, which is coming in January, and what type of plans do we have? What type of support can we implement to make sure that this project ends up being a success? And ultimately that leads to, as you can see on both columns there, submittals, because submittals is the way of a path forward of taking a concept and moving it into reality in terms of building something. And then on the construction side, mentioned it already, this working with the inspectors is crucial, because that's basically the check marks that you have to check off the checklist to be able to process and move the project forward. And then really we would get a lot of questions, at least at the outset of this, is people, instead of looking back at the developer or the manufacturer of the wood, they needed someone like Hilti, who had fire protection experience, to come in and basically give them advice. Tell us, what do we need to do here? How are we going to pass? Because one of the other indications, or one of the other really important changes, is many of the lower level wood structures that you see out there today have to carry up to a 1 hour fire rating. And then now what we basically uncovered, and what's coming in 2021 is the need for really to have 2 hour fire ratings. So this, as you can see at the bottom, this alternate means and methods has really become the main way in which developers and manufacturers partner together to build mass timber today, because critical to that is getting some type of fire rating on their construction. So with that, I'm going to turn this over at this point to Matthew. He'll go a little bit through more details of how we've kind of led the charge in the FIRESTOP testing.
So Neal, is it okay
hello.
if we go ahead and address a question or two before we transition over to Matthew?
Sounds good.
All right, so we have a question from Diana. She wanted to know, would mass timber construction be considered a type 4 construction?
It's a good question. Right now, I'm not a code expert, so I don't want to represent it. We do have that level of expertise in our organization. What I can tell you is what's coming, which is in 2021. It's kind of stealing a little bit of thunder as we come back to the code topic, which there will be 3 separate type 4 designations in 2021 as it relates to the mass timber. But there is a type of mass timber code, what do you call it, category currently, but I'm not exactly clear on which one that is specifically. Okay.
A couple other questions we've got, but they're more geared towards the fire topic, and I want to make sure that Matthew gets to cover his portion, because you may or may not address some of the questions that have been sent in. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Matthew.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Neal, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So my name is Matthew Winston. I will be going over the FIRESTOP testing efforts that Hilti has put forth to support the mass timber story. And to start, I'll help align us on which fire protection topic FIRESTOP falls within. So we like to use this slide really as an introduction to anyone to point out that there are different areas of fire protection, of course, detection, including alarms, suppression, your sprinklers. But where we live in FIRESTOP is containment. Another word is compartmentation. Really, when you have penetrations through fire resistance rated construction, or you have joints created between different elements of fire resistance rated construction, that's where the story of FIRESTOP begins. And in this slide, it gives us a bit of an overview of where we may find penetrations through fire resistance rated walls, ceilings, and joints between, again, walls and floors that need to be addressed by FIRESTOP. Again, there are code requirements that detail and specify where FIRESTOP is required, and then model building codes go on to detail which standards are used to evaluate such FIRESTOP systems. And so when we talk about the testing, it's all in the realm of FIRESTOP and compartmentation. The goal for Hilti has been to remove any barriers around FIRESTOP and FIRESTOP systems for the mass timber industry and for design firms. It's also a key life safety initiative for our fire protection group. And we've done quite a bit of effort to cover as many of the FIRESTOP test standards as possible. Those include ASTM E814 for penetrations, ASTM E1966 for joints, and then for Canada, of course, ULC S115, which covers both penetrations and joints. Moreover, the work hasn't taken place only in Hilti North America, but we do have European counterparts who have worked with the industry on that side of the globe to do testing in accordance with EN standards. And so really Hilti as an organization globally has invested in this mass timber initiative to be a partner, as Neal said, to remove the barriers and to really emphasize and support the life safety message. So when we get down into specifics, we've really got about 40 applications tested. You know, an application being you have a metal pipe penetrating through a mass timber floor or wall, as compared to a different application, it would be a plastic pipe. It includes joints, includes coverage for up to 2-hour assemblies. And even for Canada, looking at coverage for the enhanced pressure requirements that are required for non-metallic pipes in the National Building Code of Canada at 50 PA. And what's really important is testing in a variety of mass timber assemblies. Of course, Neal did a great job of giving an overview of the many great relationships that we've been able to enjoy. But of course, this allows us to ensure that solutions work across different mass timber elements, and that's going to be extremely key when we look at data extension and really how to move forward into listings. And just real quick, just as an overview, you know, not a lot of people get to see FIRESTOP testing, but in this picture here, we're actually looking at 3 different applications. So one burn, of course, you can look at more than one application, but of course, when we look at a device, for instance, I'll use my mouse here. Of course, when we look at a device like an intumescent sleeve, well, you have to test the different ranges, the envelope of that device. What does it look like when it's blank, without anything running through the device? What does it look like with cables? When you talk about recessed electrical boxes that to accommodate light fixtures, you have to look at, again, the envelope. Okay, how about with or without cover plates? So again, this is just gives you a flavor of what we do on the FIRESTOP testing side to make sure we cover everything holistically that we can basically design to the mins and the maxes that we're going to experience. Of course, with the testing that we've done, we have testing that's ongoing. Big topic is different categories of mass timber. CLT has been a focus. It's certainly been a focus, I would say, all across this story of mass timber, but for testing, it certainly has. But we are looking soon at even Dow laminated timber, mass plywood, and other elements. And so this is very exciting for us. Also, to date, there is no testing for what we call edge of slab or perimeter fire barrier systems, or another term you might have heard is curtain wall systems. That standard is ASTM E2307. Well, we hope that, again, through other collaborations, that we can turn that around and have some data for the industry later this year. And of course, the supporting design community on key projects, working with building officials directly, in some cases providing testing information for them in the absence of listings, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But I can't overemphasize just how excited I've been from the fire protection standpoint at the response of the entire mass timber industry, from organizations like Woodworks, the Canadian Wood Council, American Wood Council, to individual manufacturers. Neal has mentioned KATERRA, Nordique, DR Johnson, Structurland. We could go on. Some of the great things going on at Southwest Research Labs. Mass timber has really brought about a lot of enthusiasm for the life safety message centered around fire protection, and I'm certainly proud to be a part of the story, and I think that overall the efforts have been great. And really, to give an overview of that effort, we'll just look at a timeline, at least from Hilti's perspective, of what testing we've done. In January 2018 is when we really started to get into the planning phases, again with the research project that Neal mentioned and with KATERRA, so that by March 2018 we were able to run our first FIRESTOP test for CLT in-house. Of course, that continues in 2018, where we really focus on the KATERRA CLT assemblies. They were able to send us specimens down, and then followed by Nordique sending us specimens down. The real interesting part about that is there are actually UL-listed designs held by Lend-Lease for the Nordique floors. So that was a key topic in looking at the listing discussion with the certification agencies. And then even external labs, as I mentioned, with the Woodworks and IPEX manufacturer of piping systems, again, investing in the story of what do we do for particular penetrations in accordance with Canada approvals. And of course, it goes on to date. Again, in 2019, we did what we're doing here today, which is really trying to spread the word and the message that there are tested solutions out there, proven solutions for FIRESTOP in mass timber assemblies. And we did that at the International Mass Timber Conference last year. Of course, we all had to miss out this year, but again, with collaborations such as this online, hopefully we can still keep driving the message forward. We even looked at testing CLT members as penetrating items, and then of course, as I mentioned before, to support the design community and looking at some of the curtain wall testing, hopefully to commence before end of year. What I want to do is give you guys just a brief look at a bit of that information we shared in 2019 with regards to the FIRESTOP testing. But this is also the topic that's really important when we talk about driving the initiative forward and really leveraging efforts. And that's comparing performance across different mass timber assemblies. In this case, it was 3 different CLT assemblies. And again, the idea is data extension. If you say, well, I tested a system in a particular species of wood at a particular thickness, does that translate? You see the table here. The assemblies, there were 3 of them, varied by thickness, by wood species, by adhesive used. And what's very interesting is all 3 of these assemblies complied with PRG 320-12. So again, what we're looking to do is support the industry by saying we recognize that there can be variations in the assemblies themselves, and we want to make sure that our testing can accommodate all those variations. So there's nothing preventing the design community from making really a wonderful built environment that mass timber can provide. And what we did is we took these 3 assemblies and we put the same 5 applications within each assembly. Those applications being penetrations of metallic and non-metallic piping. And then we used the same 5 FIRESTOP systems for each penetration. The FIRESTOP systems comprising mineral wool as a backer for FIRESTOP sealant, and then also a device which involves basically a sleeve that you can drop into the floor with intumescent on both the interior and exterior of the sleeve. The exterior part is going to be very important for mass timber. But we can see here with these pictures, again, the setup that I'm describing in 2 different types of mass timber assemblies, which you can tell just by the coloration of the floors. But again, you can see the 2 copper pipes on the left, at center the insulated steel pipe, and then on the right side of this picture on the left here, the PVC and polypropylene pipes. And then on the picture on the right, you see the bottom side or the exposed side of that assembly. Again, just to give you really an overview of this is what was tested, and we tested it in 3 different CLT floors to look at the idea of data extension. Here we're looking at the exposed side of each assembly after the fire endurance test. These tests were ran for 90 minutes. Really, that was looking back at those design listings, that L901 design listing, that 90-minute rating for an exposed mass timber element, a 5-ply. And of course, there's many things that you gain, but we see that even with a loss of material, a loss of some of the layers, of CLT that we were still able to pass for fire and indeed for host stream, as we'll see on the next slide, and have good positive results, just as we would expect in concrete or any other more traditional building material. So on this slide, we're looking at, again, the exposed side of these CLT assemblies post hose stream. And if you're unfamiliar with hose stream, it's a requirement in ASTM E814 not to replicate a firefighter's hose stream, but really just to look at the integrity of a fire stop system, just to ensure that it has some integrity to withstand whatever random things might happen during a fire event, to stay in place and do its job by protecting the opening through the rated assembly. So in this comparison study, again, just briefly, failures and passing is always informative. It's very important, but we did validate the method of extending data between CLT floors. Again, as we look towards testing in other mass timber assemblies, the same will be true. What programs do we need to put in place? So for a Dow laminated timber or mass plywood or the next generation of designs, how can we quickly run some tests and evaluate and understand where the envelope of performance lies with respect to FIRESTOP? Of course, we need to protect the full depth of the CLT assembly. We don't want to have unprotected openings, even if it could pass for FIRESTOP. We still want to be mindful that these are structural elements and they should be treated as such. Designed for loss of material, that goes back into that story. And then, of course, the position of the FIRESTOP is critical. But the main thing is that FIRESTOPs are meeting performance goals in mass timber and CLT, just as they do in our traditional concrete systems. So with all that, really the question becomes of what about the listings and the certifications that everyone is used to? Well, I'd just like to start off by saying that listings are certainly best practice, yet model building codes will use the language tested and approved when it comes to FIRESTOP systems. And so when we look at the FIRESTOP testing earlier, it is done in accordance with the reference standards and code. It is then up to building officials to approve that testing just the same way they do listings. Now, this doesn't mean that our pathway to listings ends, because it's very informative and it's very easy for someone to look at a listing and understand it, as opposed to running through 100 pages of test data and then trying to translate that. But just as a quick overview, you know, a listing is a result of engineering evaluation of test data. So again, the burns and stuff that you saw, we sit down and we come to terms with the listing agency to say, what should we publish? What are we very comfortable with? That's reproducible, that will pass, that's repeatable. Since the set of instructions and rules for the installation of FIRESTOP. And again, they are best practice, although not necessarily required by code. In this picture, you see a typical header for FIRESTOP system. To at the top, it lists which standards the system is evaluated to. In this case, ASTM E814, and of course S115 for Canada. And then it gives you the ratings that apply to the FIRESTOP system, a graphic detail along with text and information that explains each item of the detail. Again, making sure that it's very easy for someone to check that, yes, the system is designed in accordance with the building code that applies in this case, and that we understand how to install the system and when this system can be put into effect. So again, certification is really required for listings. And it really refers to the products used in such systems. When we look at something like a PVC pipe or other plastic pipes, for example, steel pipes, they will have other standards that they are built and constructed to. So there is some means of controlling and limiting the variations that you'll see in products. So not necessarily everything on the listing would need to be certified. But of course, certification for FIRESTOP is something that always happens. For example, Hilti products have to be certified. This means we have plant inspections, documentation on file, and routine audits of all of our FIRESTOP products. So then we really look at, why don't we have listings to date despite adequate testing? And it's really because we are in the information gathering stage, the data gathering stage. One thing that I'm very excited about as a member of the passive design community is that the amount of test for fire resistance rated designs is extensive. You know, of course, people understand with sprinklers, yes, those are tested, but the library for fire resistance testing, which includes fire stops and of course for assemblies, is massive. So when a listing agency looks at a concrete design, they have thousands of data points to choose from, but right now only a number of data points, you know, a handful, 2 handfuls of data points when we're looking at mass timber. So really the goal is to keep the collaboration going, keep generating data, and keep working with listing agencies to come to best practices for listing. Again, we have made efforts and we continue to make efforts towards listings, testing in the UL certified designs that you see on this page, again, the M533 and L901, where we met the FIRESTOP performance criteria. And then even looking at penetrations of mass timber elements through rated walls. In the picture on the left, you see basically just a CLT member penetrating through a 2-hour gypsum wall. One thing that I get asked about, I just thought I'd mention, is a PRG 320-12 is not a fire test standard the same way that, you know, UL 1479, more specifically ASTM E119, is a test standard. It doesn't assign the ratings to the elements. It gives you best practices and guidelines to follow, but it's not a substitute for the fire resistance testing. So this means that it is likely not to be used as an element for certification going forward. But of course, the discussions continue, the collaboration continues with the listing agencies, and we really hope and believe that we can make progress on providing some listings by 2021. So with that, appreciate being able to present today, and I'll turn it back over to Neal to look at some of the code updates and implications for us.
Before we do that, Matthew, if I could interject with a couple of questions for you.
Sure, yes, please.
Okay, so we have a question from Tony, and I need to kind of set up his question. He's got some context for it, so give me just a moment here. So he's interested in your opinion regarding repair costs associated with a mass timber building after there's been a moderate-sized compartment fire in such a structure. He'd like you to assume, if you would, that there was a fire that caused enough damages to the structure to call the fire resistance rating of the floor and ceiling assembly into question. So do you feel it will be relatively easy to just kind of peel back a few layers of CLT construction and reattach new layers in a field application, or are you of the opinion that such a field repair would actually be very difficult and it would be more practical to just remove an entire building section and replace it with a new assembly?
Yeah. So I appreciate the question, Tony. I would say that this is not the area of expertise where we work in. However, I'll go back to the story of collaboration and what we're doing here today. As I recall, actually, during my panel session in the 2019 International Mass Timber Conference, there's a gentleman who I'll have to look up who presented on a very similar topic. How do you go in and rehab and repair after a fire has passed through a compartment with mass timber elements? And at the end of this presentation, we'll have some information to Woodworks website. They provide an abundance of resources to investigate different topics in mass timber. But I certainly know at the International Mass Timber Conference in 2019, something similar was presented. So we might link up so we can get you that information. Okay.
And then I wanted to get to just a couple of other questions, if I could. Hal had a question about, does Hilti work with inspectors to understand the systems and to know what kinds of shortcuts to potentially watch out for?
Yes, Hal, thank you. We do. So we have field team members who support projects directly in the local area. Of course, major construction sites, but really quite good coverage across North America and even in Europe. It's just Hilti has people out there on the ground. In this case, you look towards a fire protection specialist or one of our fastening and protection engineers that work with inspectors to help go over fire stop systems, that work with installers and specifiers to ensure the correct fire stop systems are being chosen for the application. And then where we can't Where we need to have enhanced support, we have an engineering team here in Irving, Texas. We've got about 17 fire protection engineers who field calls from all across North America and even some overseas markets on this very topic. So yes, we do support that. Sometimes inspectors will call in and ask us about a system or ask us about the use of a system on a job site. And so we do provide that support, again, both in field and then through the engineering services at the hub here in Irving.
And if I can add one small point to that, we actually have more, even to more, a little bit more granularity, we actually provide those inspectors a real, kind of similar in the vein of what we've been discussing today, an education, because the reality of the marketplace we live in is these inspectors are having to look at so many different topics on a typical job site. That one of the things that we really key in on when we educate the inspectors is giving them a story to work off of, which is make sure they understand the fundamentals of fire protection first, and then build off of that, so that when they have these conditions arise where there could be questions, and the contractors in some cases is just hoping that the inspector has a really strong positive answer, that we give the tools necessary, the confidence, so to speak, to these inspectors so that they can make sure that when they're signing their name to the inspection report, that they have confidence that what they're putting their name behind is valid. So we do that as well.
Okay. And I wanted to get to one more question. And believe me, if anybody was with us last week, you know we're going to get to your question. But I want to get to one more question before we transition back to Neal. I think this might, it depends on what you're covering exactly, it might serve as a good segue. James wanted to know, is there a simple diagram or some kind of profile / details in regards to a building section where the Hilti product can be used?
Yeah, so we do have a couple pieces of literature that give you an overview of like typical applications. I shared a slide earlier, section cutaway of a building, and said here's typically where you see FIRESTOP. So yes, we do have a few of those things in the literature, and then not necessarily in the same graphical interface, but maybe more specific to like a trade, like a mechanical trade, a plumber or an electrician. We actually have what we call basically pre-built submittals and even detail sheets that will give you your most common FIRESTOP applications for that trade. So I hope that kind of helps answer the question there.
Okay. We're going to transition back to Neal, and then we'll get to all the other questions that have been sent in right at the end. So go right ahead, Neal.
Great. So just to kind of pick up where Matt left off, I'm not a code expert, but we've been very heavily monitoring this topic of mass timber, and you really can't get intimately involved in a deep level until you understand what is the implications as it relates to the building codes. And there's I would say from perspective of a supporting manufacturer like Hilti, that's the major change coming in 2021 actually is directly related to the mass timber market. And that's, I'm definitely simplifying it. I could make this extremely complex. I don't want to do that for anyone. We have the resources if there's interest on anyone to get more detailed, comprehensive understanding of the impacts of the codes. We can provide that at a separate time. But this kind of showcases to the earlier question of, is mass timber type 4? As of 2021, the answer is yes. And to extend that, it's actually there's going to be broken out into 3 types, type 4A through C. And the difference in all those really is under 3 critical topics of relevance here. So what has to do with the height, obviously, of the building. And in order to get the required ratings, which you have to be able to, if you want to build 18 stories, which is type 4A, and you also are trying to achieve a 2-hour fire rating as a system of the building, that's going to require another important concept as it relates to this, which is encapsulation. In reality, when you look at other types of construction out there besides mass timber, in many cases, drywall, a wall assembly, as an example for penetration going through a wall, the drywall itself is what provides, in many cases, a majority of the rating. And then when you kind of run a pipe through it or something that you tear a hole through it, it takes the rating down. And then some of the products that we've traditionally used from a fire protection perspective seal that up to restore that rating. And it's really no different in that. So the questions always come up when we talk about mass timber is, how are you going to go that high and have that much exposed wood? And the reality is, while type 4A allows for the tallest structures, it also requires the most in terms of protection. So you can see there some of those, what that means. So if you want to have a 2-hour rating, you actually have to have 3 layers of drywall or some type of encapsulation product on the wall assemblies. The floors are treated a little bit differently, but the concept remains about encapsulation. And then as you go down into type 4B and C, you get more along the lines of what most people think of today when you see these really pretty exciting images online of completely exposed, natural looking, aesthetically pleasing mass timber projects. Which will probably actually be more likely to type 4C. Type 4B allows you to go up to medium height, and it also gives you variation or variable encapsulation requirements. So parts of the structure do need to be encapsulated with, again, other building materials, not necessarily drywall. And then, but there are a percentage of those structures that will allow for there to be exposed wood. And then as you go to the type 4C, it's really the most flexible. You can have a lot more encapsulation or non-encapsulation. And then you also get a little bit more in terms of what current wood structures that you see out there, which are usually, in many cases, 4 stories of wood on top of a concrete pedestal, which serves as like a parking garage. This would actually be 5 stories with encapsulation, or 85 feet max. So those are really kind of a high level overview of what's coming with in terms of January, and it has been approved. It will be a part of the building code. So it's really kind of driven our continued focus and interest on this topic, because the codes is really how we develop and center a lot of our products around, is what's coming and what's going to be allowed by the building codes. And so it's really integral to our discussion about this topic. I know this map here is kind of showcasing really, and to highlight what I just said about the growth or the expansion. We are actually seeing that there's going to be a pretty dramatic surge in terms of construction value in those major markets in the red circles, with about a little over $13 billion in project value. And this is according to a reputable source in terms of analytics for projects either in design or in construction. And then obviously it really, you see a pretty strong emphasis on the West Coast and Canada. The key markets are obviously listed there with Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, Quebec area. And then California, Oregon, Washington are continuing to drive the charge, mainly because of this, you know, the forestry industry is very robust in that part of North America. But kind of as a surprise, I saw Texas, which is where I live, as well as in Florida, where I'm from. There's actually quite a bit of interest and growing interest in this topic. So really, it showcases that there's a strong demand out there to build mass timber, and it's validated by some of the sources of project data that we all use currently out there. So now I'd like to a little bit kind of talk about what we have uncovered as one of the critical value propositions that the mass timber market brings, and how really Hilti's tried to integrate into that, quite honestly, because it's not just the story. It started with us being involved from a fire protection standpoint, but really where we feel like it's our storyline as a company. If you look at Hilti as a company, we're trying to move away from individual dealing with one application and solving one little problem. What we're trying to do is look at an overall application approach where we look at the entire application, in this case, a type of construction, and develop market our products and solutions and services and software to support that. So it's really kind of, the prefabrication is really one of the most exciting but also challenging aspects when it comes to mass timber. So with that, you know, you see some of these pictures. I had to try to find them, but I like them because they help illustrate what the benefits are, but also kind of where this idea came about and why I think a lot of the developers the general contractors, even the manufacturers are really key and excited about the future here, because as you can see on the left, in a sense, it's like Legos. You can integrate, you can build these panels, you can construct them, you can do the routers and all these different openings to create mechanical, electrical openings offsite. And then literally we witnessed this on some projects that my team and I went to in 2018 in Arkansas, University of Arkansas. You actually, they literally have these panels already pre-built. They're already kind of labeled per where section of the building they're going to be installed, and then they just piece them together. It dramatically cuts the timeline of the construction almost in half, and even in many cases quite a bit longer. I mean, what normally would be a 12 to 18 month project life cycle could be shortened down to 3 to 4 months. The delay is depending on which manufacturer you use, the lead time of getting the products delivered once they've been prefabricated. And then it really cuts down a lot on the errors. This is a neat image on the right over here showcasing the mass timber panel, the curtain wall, as Matt mentioned earlier, panels being installed onto the face or the envelope of the building, which is an exciting aspect as well. But I mean, and then one final point that we've also started to see a big trend is the footprint of these job sites have dramatically shrunk. So in many cases, the old days, you had these lay down yards, you had a lot of on-site storage capabilities. And with this, the mass timber, you don't need it. It goes away, and not goes away completely, obviously, but it dramatically reduces the need to have these complicated or large storage facilities to put your products on before you actually get them installed onto the structure. So that's kind of the driving factors of what we have seen as a supporting manufacturer of why prefabrication is a really key part of the mass timber value proposition. And then to kind of conclude the session for today, and as it relates to our story, is really to showcase some of what we're doing to support this as a manufacturer, and making sure that we have solutions that are relevant. Obviously, there's some images in here that are kind of don't relate specifically to mass timber, but what it does do is showcase some of the products and services, mainly products, obviously, that incorporate for us innovation. As a manufacturer, we're not just focused on fire protection. There's other aspects of tooling, such as cutting and coring. We've actually, when Matt was doing a lot of the tests for some of the mechanical electrical penetrations, we used our diamond tipped core bits to core out the holes so we could do the tests for some of the mechanical penetrants, or other types of penetrants. And we actually found that it works very well, almost too well, because the diamond segments don't deteriorate, they maintain themselves. So it's almost, I don't want to call it an infinite solution, but it does do very well. So anyway, exploring some of those ways to enhance or optimize productivity is really some essential part of what we're trying to do as a manufacturer. And then there's other tools as well. Some of the cool innovations in terms of the specific to FIRESTOP that we've worked on. Down here you can see a few of them. There's what we have is called a top track seal product, which is actually something that you would actually attach or drape over the top track when you're installing the framing into the structure if it's a framed wall assemblies. And that provides a FIRESTOP solution, as well as other benefits, acoustics, smoke performance as well is also incorporated within that design. The middle product is a low voltage pathway solution called a speed sleeve, which provides obviously for cabling, data, any type of low voltage application, an effective FIRESTOP mechanism that allows you to run the cables and either leave them open or closed depending on the construction type. And that provides a really simple, easy to install solution for all your data needs in terms of fire protection. And then you get into drop-in devices. Matt did quite a bit of extensive testing on our drop-in products, and we found that they worked very well. It allows you to provide a sleeved opening through the planks, through the mass timber planks. It has a smoke seal, and it allows you to basically lift off an OSHA approved cap, run your penetrant through it, and you've now got a completed, installed, acceptable FIRESTOP system assembly put together. So this is just kind of giving you a little bit of an idea of kind of what we've been working with in terms of this topic of innovation. And then really to kind of finish up here, one of the exciting things that I'm really proud of, like Matt mentioned on the testing side, on the product development side, you can see some of the products that Hilti supports, but also that we're working on development. I just had a recent conversation with a counterpart of mine in our anchoring business unit, and she was she's basically working on development of adhesive anchoring technology for the mass timber market. So we have some of the best, most famous, I guess, if you will, anchoring products in the world. If any of you are familiar with the Big Dig, you can look us up online about what that was all about. But we are looking at alternatives to some of the challenges faced with the adhesives, not necessarily as from an anchoring perspective, but maybe figuring out a way to integrate formaldehyde-free, as an example. It kind of goes together with the idea of, if you're trying to build a mass timber project, one of the things you're probably keen on is sustainability. And formaldehyde is, from what I understand about this topic, which I do a little bit, it's not a good thing to have in products as you try to build something that has to do with green building. So we're working on that. We also are looking at potentially carbide tip technology for some of our coring tools, so we can allow for an easier prefabrication. Screw fastening is one of the other foundations of our company. Not that we were built on the screw fastening topic, we actually invented some of the powder actuated direct fastening products that you may or may not, nail guns and pin guns, as well as some of the drilling technology and cordless tools and cutting. And then finally, some of the measuring and layout tools that we're working on in terms of development are innovative in the way of how you can look at a project, how you can lay out the project either virtually or in person, and really have almost like a robotic way of installing different penetrant types and other types of applications. So there's a really exciting trend and movement, not only to mass timber, but the technology that supports it. So with that, I wanted to leave you guys, before we get into any questions that you may have, if you have any questions for Matt and I, of some additional resources that are available to you to help you kind of solidify, but also enhance your education levels when it comes to this topic of FIRESTOP specifically. That's really what we've been spending most of our time on, and just other information related to the mass timber. So you can see there's a FIRESTOP 101, kind of like a basics of fire stopping, and then we kind of expand on that with some code requirements relating to the fire stopping topic in Canada. And then overall overview of facade design for the design community as well. Not to mention the International Fire Stop Council, as well as Woodworks, are great organizations that provide a wealth of information as it relates to what's happening, and really how an organization such as whoever's on this call today can integrate and work well within the framework that's mass timber. So with that, that's all we had at this point. I guess at this point we'll turn it back over to Mike and see what questions we have.
Yes, thank you very much, gentlemen. And we do have a handful of questions, and I've encouraged people via the chat box to send in their questions now. We're going to go ahead and start with probably a thank you. We had a question from Hal about the adhesive and the sustainable aspects or lack of sustainable aspects on the adhesive. So thank you for addressing that question. Also, I wanted to share a little bit of input from an attendee. We're going back to Tony's question. If you recall, about, okay, do you peel some layers back or do you replace the section? So I want to share with you a little bit of input from one of our attendees. Gentleman's name is Jeff, and he used to work for TRADA, T-R-A-D-A, in the UK. And he worked mostly in structural research, but they had a great fire test facility, and he's now a practicing PE. And he's now based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. His comment is, and you obviously, gentlemen, are welcome to follow up on this comment verbally as soon as I'm done, but his comment is, yes, you can rebuild cross-laminated timber in place. You need a structural engineer that understands CLT construction and laminated wood products, an understanding of how loads are transmitted through structures, a bit of creativity on how to create the repair, and usually an epoxy resin repair contractor that has experience at doing such a rebuild. And when he worked at TRADA in the UK, he did technical support for contractors repairing large glulam beams and a suspended layered wood shelf roof system. So I share that with you and with the audience, but obviously, Neal, Matthew, you can chime in there with what Jeff was talking about.
Yeah, so this is Matthew. I'll just go to say again, you know, the more collaboration that you see, this is what's exciting for mass timber is, you know, the more you find out. So definitely resources out there. So I definitely appreciate that feedback from Jeff. So.
Wanted to get to a couple of specific questions in regards to when you were showing the map earlier about some of those future projects. So Heather had a question, are those multifamily or commercial projects or a mix of both? Can you give us a little bit of a breakdown on some of those?
Yeah, when I actually had one of our internal personnel, part of our what we call our marketing insights and analytics team, put that together. They provided me a list, and it is a mix. You're absolutely right. It is both multifamily, high rise, if you will, mainly on the west coast. That's really what we're seeing a lot of, and to a lesser degree commercial. But there are there's progressive organizations, there's rising startups, there's tech companies that we've seen, even some. I don't know. I guess I could say it. There's some of the big guys you think of when it comes to tech. They're looking at making regional or smaller offices with mass timber. I guess I could say it. The Facebooks, the Amazons, but not specifically to those two, but there are looking at regional offices and they're looking at alternative construction types. So it's definitely part of that research that was collected.
Okay. And then also, I don't know if you're able to pull that map back up. Were there projects in Florida by chance?
Yes, there were. There's 20 that I found on this report, and yeah, so there were. I mean, if there's an interest, and depending on how we end this webinar, there's a potential we can connect. We can share that information with you guys.
Okay, that question came in from Drew. He just was curious about the location of some of the Florida projects. I want to also get to a couple of other questions that we have, and again, people can send in their questions via the questions box. Lindsay wanted to know, what is your opinion of bamboo laminated timber? Have you performed fire testing on those systems?
Oh, that's actually interesting. We have not, but it's interesting because Hilti globally has some initiatives as far as getting back to communities across the world, and I believe we actually did some bamboo construction in certain parts of the world to help people with housing. But no, nothing on the fire side actually at this time, and I haven't heard of it really in North America to date. So.
Okay. Elizabeth had a question. Are there any recent case studies from the fire-torn regions of California?
Not that I'm aware of. In those cases, you know, in California, typical are the wood shake roofs, so not necessarily the mass timber construction that we're talking about. But you know, for that, I would have to maybe look at some resources provided by the NFPA. I don't have anything that comes to mind through my studies. So.
Okay. Speaking of alternative systems, you know, Lindsay mentioned bamboo. Nina had a question. She's wanting to know your opinion on DLT, which, for those of you who aren't aware, is dowel laminated timber. She also wanted to know, what are the advantages and disadvantages of DLT, such as like where it could or maybe where it shouldn't be used?
Yeah, so dowel laminated timber is we actually received some samples of that to our laboratory in recent weeks, and we'll be performing testing on that. For advantages, you know, it's that you really don't rely on adhesives necessarily for the integrity of the floor. You rely on the dowels. I would have to get a bit more into specifics to see if there's really a performance difference when it comes to spans. of the assemblies themselves. But I do know, at least for penetrations, one should keep in mind the position of the dowels. So that's something that we're actually going to investigate through the FIRESTOP testing efforts is, can you run through a dowel and still pass the fire test? How does that affect the performance of the rest of the floor? So great question.
Okay. I know we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to make a final call to send in your questions. Right now, I've got one left in the hopper, so I appreciate everybody sticking around just a tiny bit longer. This question came in from James. He wanted to know, as you may know, timber tends to shrink. What is the service life for Hilti FIRESTOP, and does it require maintenance for the product?
Yeah, so in the building code, at least in the international building code, there is really a broad provision for any fire system that you need some sort of inspection, and usually that requirement is annually. As far as maintenance go, no, FIRESTOP systems do not need maintenance so long as inspection doesn't reveal that you had damage or impairment of the FIRESTOP system. But if a system is just allowed to basically exist without damage, falling debris, or any such thing, then really for the life of the building, that's the life of the FIRESTOP system. We do receive engineering requests for environments that might be corrosive. Aquariums is very common, where you have chlorine or other agents that are present in the air. So in those cases, perhaps there might be a closer look, but really that's mitigated by more routine inspection and perhaps more trained inspection individuals. But once a FIRESTOP system is in, it should be expected to last the life of the building.
Okay. Oh, good news. We're getting a couple more questions in. This is one from Diana. She says, can you address how the requirement for insulation for the building thermal envelope would affect fire stopping?
Yeah, that's a really great question in so many ways. Yeah, aluminum frame curtain wall and how wide or deep the members are. So, for example, typically what we're starting to see now is what I just say generally is bigger curtain walls. So mullions that instead of 5.5 or 6 inches deep are getting up to 12 inches deep. Again, for insulation purposes, for other purposes too. Insulation again, so you can have thicker glass systems, seeing some glass systems approach 2 inches, double paned. So, but to the point of insulation, just imagine if you had a thinner profile of aluminum members, say 6 inches, and then somebody still wants to install something aesthetic between the insulation and the glass. The most common term is a shadow box. Well, you've got to make sure that you can fit everything in that area and then still install your FIRESTOP system and make sure that the FIRESTOP the position of the FIRESTOP system is correct. So really in that case, sometimes it's just adding thicker insulation can kind of displace where things line up. Another thing is oftentimes for curtain walls, most testing you see will rely on insulation that's 8 pounds per cubic feet density. And usually what we do is we test the most severe, so 2 inch, so pretty thin insulation. But then on a building, it turns around and they'll go look at 4 inch thick, but 4 density, PCF density insulation. So that comes up again with the design is, can you substitute what's equivalent for the sake of fire performance? So just a few examples of how we come across that.
Okay. Got a couple more questions. This is one from Yao, I believe, and if I mispronounced your name, I apologize for that. But the question is, can CLT floor panel connections meet integrity rating with proper seal and FIRESTOP? Given the CLT deck is not protected on the top surface, such as concrete or gypsum board, the floor is 1 hour rated. Can you kind of talk to that question in the comment there?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in 2 ways. So integrity rating, where I've heard it is in regards to the perimeter fire barrier systems. Again, for ASTME 2307, there is actually a requirement for an integrity rating. It's not required by code, but there is an allowance for it within the standard. So in that case, you're really looking at things besides the floor assembly that would affect whether or not you can obtain that rating. One requirement for that rating is temperature criteria. And if you imagine, if you have a very aggressive design on the facade, a lot of glass, a lot of aluminum, then when you run the 2307 test, the glass breaking, aluminum melting is going to affect whether you get that integrity rating of potentially more than what's going on with the floor. If the question is in regards to fire resistance ratings, the traditional ASTME 119, then there's actually testing ongoing that shows FIRESTOP sealants being used at those connections to great effect. So if you remember in the presentation, we looked at one UL design listing where the floor was achieved a 90-minute rating. It was a 5-ply floor, 6 7/8 inch thick overall, without encapsulation on the bottom. So we've seen similar floor assemblies retested to the same standard to 119, but adding FIRESTOP sealant at the spline joint. So that, and what we see in that design listing is what's referred to as a spline joint, where they cut a groove out of the top of the panels where they meet and set plywood on top. There's other different joint connections, but the short answer is adding an intumescent sealant has indicated enhanced fire performance for fire resistance design of the floor assemblies. So that's something that we're kind of working with the industry and a few folks who've done that testing to explore further.
Okay. Heather had a question. Do you know how many factories in the U.S. are capable of fabricating CLT and MPP, mass plywood panels? So how many are there in the U.S.?
I don't have. I would say that it's growing. For FIRESTOP, we see interesting trends, and where we might not know specifics, we know the trend. There's more manufacturers of CLT coming online. There's a growing variety of mass timber options. So mass plywood is now starting to get some really good attention. There's a number of manufacturers we've seen there. The Dow laminated timber, glue laminated timber. So I can't tell you really any numbers, but I can say that it's whatever the number is, it's likely to increase, at least in the medium term.
And I'll add to that just a bit, where we do have some of the manufacturers that we mentioned earlier in terms of our partnerships that we've developed. Many of them are building manufacturing facilities around where you find sustainable forestry. In many cases, that's up in the Pacific Northwest, as well as even in markets such as Arkansas. Arkansas is one of the hotbeds of where they're able to, process lumber, but also have it set up in such a way that it's sustainable, so it can drive the production value of mass timber construction with the paneling of it, but also obviously have a replenishment or replenishable source down the road. So if you're trying to find or locate where some of those manufacturers have operations, many of them are going to be centered in wherever you can find research to support these massive sustainable forestry areas of North America mainly.
All right, I don't see any other questions, so I want to extend a big thank you to Neal and Matthew for sharing their time and their intelligence and knowledge and insight with us today. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
I also want to thank our audience for attending and asking wonderful questions. We very much appreciate all of you, and thank you to Hilti North America for their generous sponsorship of this webinar. We're going to be back with another webinar in just 6 days. That's right, on Wednesday, June 24th at 3 p.m. Eastern, so a little bit later than normal. We'll be talking about the upcoming fire season, so it kind of ties into what we were talking about today, but also how to mitigate potential losses. So make sure you join us for that. Until then, please continue to stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope all the dads out there have a great Father's Day weekend. You know, I think I hear the proverbial recess bell ringing, so class is dismissed for today.